know something I'm looking forward to? Summer and getting a tan, because I see myself in the viewfinder and I look like a vampire. I'm so ready for a tan. Doesn't relate to anything in this video, but I'm right there and I'm white. Come on, summer. There's a quote by Shakespeare in the movie, in the play Romeo and Juliet, that reads, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." It's a very popular saying. I think we all kind of know it, even if we aren't really sure where it comes from or have never even seen Romeo and Juliet. It's one of those sayings that it's interesting beyond how it seems. Like, it seems kind of straightforward, but when you actually think about it, it's really interesting. If you called a rose a fish, would that make it smell like a fish? Like something like that. Like, the meaning of the name. Is there any purpose to a name, or is it just a title, something that we put on something? Does it actually have any meaning? And biblically speaking, names always meant something very important. It's really cool to look up the biblical meaning of a name or what it meant in that time. I don't think anyone named their kid just based on, I like this name. It seems like they named their children according to what they hoped for them, or something like strength or God is with us or whatever. It's interesting that they named them according to what the name meant rather than, I'm guessing no one was like, ooh, I like the name Methuselah or Jehoiakim. I really don't understand the names back then, but they had meaning a lot more than nowadays. You name your pet or your kid. You name names based on names that you like. You don't pick based on the meaning. I really like that name, but it doesn't mean what I want this child to represent, so I'm not going to name him that. We don't think like that anymore, but biblically, it was very, very common to name based on what the name meant. And so this kind of whole thought process got me thinking a while back about what Jesus' name actually meant. I think we all know, kind of, but the fact is, who we know as Jesus was not known as Jesus at the time that he was alive. We know that he was, biblically speaking, in the old times, he was known as Yeshua or Yeshua. That's the Jewish way of saying his name. However, that is, I think it's the Greek version that we've translated into English to come up with Jesus, but Yeshua meant Joshua according to our version. If we said it the way that it was accurate back then, nowadays, we're used to Jesus, but really his name was Joshua. So anyone named Josh or Joshua now actually has the same name as Jesus. But if you go around calling Jesus Joshua, it gets really confusing because there's no weight to Joshua. We don't think of it that way. But you say Jesus, there's weight to it. We know who you're talking about immediately, but Joshua could mean anyone. And the funny thing is, in Joshua's time, there would have been hundreds of Joshuas, thousands probably. It was a very common name, probably because of Joshua from the Old Testament, Moses' sidekick. He was probably someone that people in that time really looked up to, and they named their sons Joshua. And Joshua, or Yeshua, or Jesus, meant God saves. And what's interesting is, I had never known this, that Joshua, son of Nun, back in the Old Testament, he was actually originally called Hosea, and it says in, hold on, I've got my Bible, Numbers 13:16? Yes, Numbers 13:16, it says, so they're talking about all the spies that were sent into Canaan. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, and Moses called Hosea, the son of Nun, Joshua. So that would be, his name would have changed from Hosea to Yeshua. Not much difference, but it's funny that Moses would change this guy's name. He was clearly old enough to go be a spy. It's not like he was a little kid and they decided to change his name. He wasn't his son or anything like that. But for some reason, Moses chose to name this guy a slightly different name. And what's really interesting is that Hosea, or what we now know as Hosea, meant salvation, and Yeshua, or Joshua, meant Yahweh saves. So it was just a simple change from being about just salvation to being God being salvation, or Yahweh. So what we know as Jesus, not who, but the word Jesus, the name, is the Greek translation or the Greek version of Joshua. So we have Joshua in our language too, and we would not name someone Jesus, but we would name them Joshua. And I mean, they're the same thing. It's just a different translation. Instead of going from Hebrew to English, which is Joshua, going from Hebrew to Greek to English becomes Jesus. So we don't name anyone that, because that would be like disrespectful. But we name people Joshua, and that we just don't even think about that. But the fact is, Jesus was raised by Hebrew parents, so he was probably called Yeshua. Actually, no doubt he was called Yeshua. But that name wasn't uncommon, right? Again, there was probably like hundreds of Yeshua of Nazareth or whatever. Like, he would have been Yeshua bar Joseph. Should have been bar Yahweh, but that wouldn't work. With bar means son of, I guess, in that time. Son of or from of, whatever. So it'd be Jesus or Joshua, son of Joseph. But Joshua wasn't a family name. I actually went through the list of Joseph's ancestors and Mary's ancestors, and Joshua doesn't come up. That was a name that God specifically chose for Jesus. You will call him Yeshua. And what's interesting is that God chose a name that represented who Jesus would be, but it wasn't a name that stood out. Like I said, there'd be hundreds of them. It wasn't a name that would have jumped out at people as really unique, where we read the Bible and there's no other Jesus in there. But there are other Joshuas, but we just don't see it that way. And a while ago, this got me thinking, that whole bar Joseph thing. When you come to the Easter story and Jesus is on trial and they bring out Barabbas, I'm like, okay, wait, Barabbas would mean, we read it as one name, but Bar-Abbas would have meant son of Abbas. So I thought, why would he be known as that and not his first name? And I started to do a bit of research, because it got me thinking, what if his name was Yeshua too? And that's why he was taken out of jail. It was like, we have two Yeshuas here. Do you want Yeshua bar Joseph, Yeshua the king of the Jews, or Yeshua bar Abbas, who is the fighter with the Jews kind of thing? Which I just think is fascinating. I love digging up these details in the Bible that we don't necessarily see at first glance. We know the name Barabbas and we don't think anything of it, where once you actually put your brain in gear and you're like, wait a minute, Bar-Abbas means son of, it probably means that his name was actually Yeshua Bar-Abbas versus Yeshua bar Joseph, which I just think is so cool. That's probably why Barabbas had been chosen, was because, Pilate or the guards or whoever thought, wait a minute, we've got this other guy in the prison whose name is Yeshua. Let's bring him out and set them against each other, and then they can pick which Yeshua they want. Just these little things that are in these stories that we overlook, which I just think are so cool. And what's actually even more interesting to me, I love these connections in the Old Testament where you go back and you see something and you're like, okay, wait, that was foreshadowing of Jesus. And there are so many instances of it. I mean, last week we talked about the serpent, which you wouldn't think would be an example of Christ, and yet it was. And so I looked up different names or different times Yeshua or Joshua were in the Bible, and I came across the very last king of Israel before they were taken away and before God basically took his favor off of them. The very last king was named King Hoshea. So that at that time, their last king was salvation. And then Jesus comes, he's the next king, he's the last king. He's the only king that the Israelites are ever going to need, the world's going to need, and his name was King Yeshua. So it went from King Salvation of human standards to the king God brought. That was Yahweh saving. And I love that. I love that the last king before Jesus wasn't Yeshua or Joshua. It was Hoshea. It was the guy who thought he could do it on his own. And this guy was, he was a piece of work. It was really interesting looking him up. He reigned, again, he was the last king of Israel. And this is, I think actually what I read was that the Israelite people actually tried to anoint another king after God took his favor off them, but he wasn't from the line of David, I think, and so that king wasn't recognized, if I'm remembering correctly. But who's titled as the very last king is King Hoshea, and he failed to save his people. He was up against, I think it was the Assyrians, and he had tried to pay off the Assyrians or something like that. They had gotten him in as king, so he got in illegally, and then he stopped paying when that king of Assyria died. And the son of that king then came after Hoshea, who they found out was kind of cheating on them with an Egyptian king. He was paying them instead, trying to get the Egyptians' favor. And God just got tired of it, and he let Hoshea be taken by the Assyrians and probably imprisoned and killed. So he failed. He did not save his people. And then hundreds of years later, the real king comes on the scene. King Yeshua, King God saves. And he does save his people from their sins. It's not just saving them from an army, saving them from the Romans, which he didn't do. He died at the hands of the Romans. He saved them eternally, which King Hoshea and none of the kings before could have done. And another interesting note about Hoshea is the Assyrian army captured Samaria, Israel. They took the king, they took Hoshea away, and the people withstood the war, or I guess they barricaded themselves inside the town and kept themselves safe for 3 years. And this was without a king. They survived 3 years without a king, which is interesting. But it was 3 years. And how long was Jesus' ministry? It was 3 years. So while King Hoshea failed and then his people had to survive without him for 3 years, here we have Jesus, Yeshua, being with his people and teaching them, building them up for 3 years before he ultimately saved his people. And I'm sure we all know the verse that says, you will call his name Joshua, or Yeshua, Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Literally, you will call his name Yeshua because he will do what his name says, because he will save his people, because God will save. Which I just think is so cool. Again, we hear these verses, we know them by heart, and we hear it around Christmas time, and it, makes us happy because we know the story, and it fits the time of year, but we don't actually think about what it means. Like, when the Bible says because or for, it means that what I just said relates perfectly to what I'm about to say, or it's connected, like, it's intertwined, and I don't think I ever thought about why it says, you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. We just think that's what he said, that's why he said it, there's no reason to it. And yet there's this whole huge meaning behind it that Mary would have instantly known that the name Yeshua meant Yahweh saves. You will name your son Yahweh saves because Yahweh will save his people from their sins. And still kind of on the Christmas theme, in Luke 2:25, the top of that section says, Simeon sees God's salvation. Literally, Simeon the priest saw Yeshua. He saw God's salvation. I'm just going to read it to you because it's kind of cool. And behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. Those are capitalized. That's another name or title of Jesus. And the Holy Spirit was upon him, and it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. So Christ, I know we kind of think of Jesus Christ as being his full name. Christ meant Messiah, so he was known as Yeshua Messiah. So they knew that he was from God. So Jesus Christ was just this declaration of from God, basically. God's salvation from God. It's really interesting. Do you know how many times I say it's really interesting because I don't know how to end a sentence when it's really interesting? Anyways, so he came by the Spirit into the temple. In other words, God sort of nudged him and said, Simeon, today's the day. Go in the temple. Don't miss him. So we don't know how old he was, but I'm guessing he was quite an old man at this point. So he came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, Simeon, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation. My eyes have seen Yeshua, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. So I'm guessing he probably asked Mary and Joseph, what's the child's name? And they would have said Yeshua. And he would have known instantly. Again, these bells going off. This is him. I'm sure there were a ton of baby boys brought into the temple to be circumcised and dedicated to God, and none of them perked his ears. But this one, who he knew was special, with a name like that, he knew that this was the one that God had sent. So for Shakespeare to ask that question, what is in a name, there's so much behind Jesus' name. And I'm not going to stop calling him Jesus because obviously that's how I know him. That's who he is to all of us. But Yeshua was his real name. And it meant so much more than Jesus does to us. To us, Jesus is the name of someone in the same way as my name is Tracy. You don't think of any depth behind that name. It's just who I am. It's who you address when you're talking to me. So we don't get the weight behind what it means. But even though it's been translated a few times over, Jesus still means God's salvation. It means Yahweh's salvation. Yahweh saves. And it's cool because there was a movie released last year or 2 years ago now called Risen. I'm going to review that. One thing I really loved about that movie is that in it they called Jesus Yeshua. They used the real authentic name, and it felt so real. It felt so cool. And I feel like if we did use his name, or if we thought about him with the weight of his name instead of just Jesus, you get a bigger picture of him. There's just more. There's more color with everything you learn about Jesus. Everything adds up, and you get this more bright and brilliant picture of the man who literally came to save us, who is our salvation. He's the reason that we have hope. And he came being God's salvation. He was the way that God was going to save us. And I just think that's so cool. Again, there's so many layers, and if you start peeling them back, you start to see things that you never did before. It's so cool. Like the Barabbas thing is just so interesting to me. I can't not see now that his name was probably Yeshua too, and that's the only reason he was plucked out of prison. I am guessing that the Romans had a lot of people in their prison, probably several that they were going to crucify. So why did they pick this one guy out of however many? It makes total sense that it would have been because of his name. It's so cool. There's so many things that are fascinating about the Bible, and we just overlook it, and it's really cool when you actually dig in and see it. So I hope that I've made it kind of interesting for you. I don't know. I like it. I love these patterns in the Bible where you go back in the Old Testament and you see Jesus, and I'm starting to kind of take note of that now. I'm starting from the beginning of the Old Testament, and I'm just writing down every time I see Jesus, every time I see a reflection of him, or someone who you can see is kind of playing the role ahead of time. No one played the role the way Jesus did. No one died for their people the way Jesus did. But you can see in the kings, Jesus's kingship being perfected in him. The idea of kingship was a reflection of what was to come. And in the prophets, you can see Jesus. And in everything, you can see Jesus. The Bible is full of Jesus, which is something that I never used to see. The Old Testament to me was kind of boring, because, well, not boring, but like there's a lot going on, but it didn't interest me because I didn't see anything beyond face value. And once you start peeling back the layers and seeing Jesus in it, it's so interesting. God is the most incredible storyteller. You can see all of these things weaving through, all these people playing versions of Jesus ahead of time. And I mean, this was their real life. They didn't have a script that they were playing by. They were living their life, and somehow people living their lives reflected what was to come. It's just, you can see how completely in control God is over everything that happens, and it happened then because he was working everything together until it came to Jesus. And then it was like everything that happened before, it was all leading up to this. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next week.